We appear to be live.
Are we indeed? It's crazy. Well, welcome to our deep dives on Thursday afternoons. I'm here with Josh. It's pretty great. We're having a good time on a beautiful, sunny Thursday afternoon after a couple of days of rain and cold. It seems like it's nice and warm, so
I'm finding this amusing because we have the room dark apart
I
from
know,
us.
right?
And so you're saying this, but from our perspective, the room looks really gloomy. There's just lights at us. It's like, hey, it's a great day outside. And we kind of feel like we're in a cave or a dungeon.
It's glorious. And so today we're gonna just pop over to some maybe a conversation about the disciples and maybe what that kind of looked like, what their lives look like, just everything. So if you're here, you're watching, we'd love to know if you're here. And if you have any questions about the disciples, and maybe as we kind of get started, maybe it would be a good thing to define who are disciples, because there are a couple of different passages where, really we're maybe is it 100, is it 500, is it just the guys who wrote the most of the New Testament? Where does Paul fit? Any of that sort of things. So Josh, why don't we just start with kind of that? Who are the disciples? Who do we count as the disciples, and what does that kind of look like?
Sure. So the term disciple is a follower, someone who follows. And so very early on, as Jesus was beginning his ministry, people were like, hey, this guy's special. There's something up here. And I mean, as a religious teacher, people who wanted to learn from him would begin following him. And so the term disciple was just a follower. The term apostle is someone who is sent out. And so very early on, we see Jesus have a lot more disciples than 12. In Luke 10, there's a passage about where he sends 70 people, 70 disciples out to spread, to talk, to teach, to cast out demons in his name. And so if there are 70, why do we focus on 12? It's we're going to differentiate here between some other people who people are like, is that guy who is that guy and why is he important? Like Mark or John Mark, who wrote Mark, didn't meet Christ in life to our knowledge. Followed Paul, then learned from Peter afterwards. Luke also followed Paul, wrote just because he wasn't there for the beginning doesn't mean that he didn't compile an amazing historical account by interviewing tons of witnesses, getting a ton of information. The book of James and the book of Jude are notable in that they did know Christ very well as his brothers, but they weren't one of his disciples in the gospel. It was after Jesus died, resurrected, they finally started to get it, and they were very powerful in the early church, but they were not disciples. The book of James was not written by either of the disciples named James. There were two.
That's nice. Hey, Lindsay and Lauren, thanks for watching. If you're watching, we'd love to see who is watching. So just give us a shout out. Let us know if you're here, and we'd love to say hi. And if you have any questions over what Josh is saying, what I say, any of that sort of stuff,
Generally on topic, anything.
yeah, anything. It doesn't even have to be on topic. It's more helpful, but
No.
we're good. So. All right, so I think we're back to more disciples.
Yeah,
or non-disciples.
There's two more that I'll hit here in a little bit. In that, I guess I'll mention that Philip the evangelist, in the beginning of Acts, there was a lot of work that needed to be done in the early church. And so they appointed 7 people to sort of oversee that work. And one of the most famous ones is Stephen, because he was the first martyr that we have a record of. But there was another guy who was appointed among those 7 who was named Philip. And in the book of Acts, we see a guy named Philip have a very effective preach in Samaria after the church in Jerusalem starts to scatter due to persecution. Not scatter in terms of disorganized, but scatter in terms of decentralized. And so a lot of effective ministry in Samaria. And then as that ministry was just going amazingly, God called him to minister to this Ethiopian who was traveling down the road. And so there's a lot of assumption that that Philip is the Philip, the disciple. But we see that when his ministry was going so well in Samaria, they're like, hey, what's going on up there? Let's send some apostles up there, right? If it was apostle already up there, it wouldn't have been that level of confusion. It wouldn't have been that level of like, hey, let's go check on this. This seems awesome. It would have been like a great job, Philip, you.
Good job, you guy.
And that's not to say that they wouldn't have, continued to bolster that ministry, but just the response to it really suggests that this is the Philip we learn about in Acts, not the Philip we learn about in the Gospels. And so there's a lot of confusion there of someone else who is frequently confused for a disciple. But really, there's also a bit of confusion that the term apostle comes after Jesus' death. Because if it means to send out, it would make sense that they would be called that once they were being sent out.
Yeah.
But the life of what it looked like to walk with Jesus was there were a whole bunch of people following him, but he called this sort of inner circle that would go out and almost like be his representatives in ways. And those he called apostles from the beginning. We're going to flip over to Luke 6, 13 through 16, because we really see not only that the 12 were called from within this larger body of disciples, but they were also called apostles from the very beginning. And so,
I got it. Awesome. I'm assuming it's this one
6,
here.
13 through 16.
So, hey, Paige, it's good to see you're here. Yeah.
So I'm actually going to start at 12 because it says, one day soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. Okay, then we really get into it in 13. At daybreak, he called together all of his disciples and chose 12 of them to be apostles. Here are their names: Simon, who he called Peter; Andrew, Peter's brother; James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. So we're going to look into what the Bible has to say about these individuals. But we see that they're called apostles from the very beginning, but they weren't exclusive in that they weren't the only people following. In the Gospels, the term disciple and apostle gets used pretty interchangeably because not even all of these guys get lines. Like, even all of these guys have dialogue that's recorded in the Gospels. So if they don't have dialogue that's recorded in the Gospels, how much less do some other disciples who were maybe there for a week, there for a month, there for a while, then they go back home and they work, and then they come back and whatever. And so there were a lot of people who were very interested in following Jesus, but weren't either there for the entire time, the entire duration, or there's just a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Last one that often gets confused, I'll just throw this in now, is that in Acts 1, 12 through 26, it talks about this meeting in the early church. At the very end of that meeting, they talk about how Judas Iscariot is dead. He's no longer considered among them as he, betrayed Christ to be crucified. And Peter says, hey, we should replace him. And so they decide, okay, who has witnessed Christ from the beginning, who has been tracking with us all this time, who has been some we know because they were with us, they traveled with Jesus, they just weren't in this inner circle. And they come up with two guys, and then they pray and they cast lots. And Matthias,
Maybe can you explain what casting lots means?
yes,
So I bet there's a lot of people who are like, what does that mean?
okay. I will finish the sentence first and say Matthias
Okay.
was chosen to replace Judas. I got distracted because there's a typo on the screen that may come up later. Yeah. But so anyway, so he got chose to replace Judas.
That typo is really good.
It just totally derailed. Yeah.
Incredible.
So
they choose Matthias
Right,
to replace Judas.
So how casting lots worked was you had a decision that you had to make, and you just put it entirely in God's hands.
Okay.
So you just prayed about it really fervently in community over the decision, and then you, after that prayer, after that very intentionality, seeking God's answer, you essentially did something that would allow for randomness in a way that God could then make his will known.
Okay.
So like a common example would be like, hey, one stick's shorter than all the rest, or like even like a coin flip or a dice roll or whatever. It was this idea of very intentionally and fervently praying to God for him to provide the answer, and then giving him an opportunity to do something to differentiate which is which. And so like if it was the case where the decision was between you and I, like maybe we pray about it a ton and then we flip a coin or something. It's that sort of doing something random to give God a more physical way to express his choice. And it's not used a lot. It's certainly not used for every decision. But this was an instance where that is the method they used.
Okay. So that's kind of the outside guys. Okay, so now if we're just focusing in on those guys on the Luke 6:13 through 16, probably the way we should start, right? There's 12 names on there, but there are three kind of main players that we end up seeing throughout kind of the Gospels. As if you were looking at kind of like, the crew, these three are the ones that typically are in almost all of the major stories.
I'm going to take one step back and go with the
okay.
brother of one of those three,
Oh, solid.
with Andrew.
Okay.
Going to start with Andrew, and that's because he was a disciple of John the Baptist. When he was with John the Baptist, John the Baptist was like, hey, that's the guy I've been talking about. And him and some unnamed person ran after Jesus, learned from him a bit, and then Andrew went to Peter and was like, hey, you got to come meet this guy. This guy's awesome. Peter then met Jesus. Jesus was like, I'm going to call you the Rock. And Peter was like, cool, thanks, Messiah. And then they go home to Galilee and start fishing. So,
Classic. That's what I would do.
so Andrew had a lot of impetus in introducing some of the first disciples to Christ. And that is why I went with him first.
Okay.
He was a fisherman alongside Peter. They lived in a little town on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee called Bethsaida.
Okay.
And that's going to come up one or two more times here as we talk about other disciples. And so after this, he really gets overshadowed by his brother Peter.
Yeah.
In the gospel narratives, there's a few times he comes up, and some of those times it's alongside Philip. Not all of them, but he is just far overshadowed by the loudmouth that is Peter.
Say first, do first, think second.
So,
Peter.
So something that I find interesting about Peter is that, like David, they both sort of had this connection with God really wanting to use them. And both of them were very much the type of person who, when something was going on in their heart, they just said it, right? There wasn't all these layers of like subtlety or subterfuge or misdirection. It was just like, here's the thing I'm thinking, blah. And it's not that I think we need to be shouting, but there's an honesty there.
Yep.
An honesty that even if I'm wrong, blah.
Yep. I'm just gonna say it.
Yeah. And so we see Peter be used a lot to be the loud voice of what the disciples are generally thinking, because he's the one who gets tired of the silence first. It's like, here's what I'm thinking, blah. And Jesus is like, that's real dumb. You don't get it yet.
He's the junior high boy of the
Yeah.
group. Shots fired. I'll say
So,
it.
well, as a junior high boy of the group, he was married.
That's true.
So one of Jesus's earliest miracles with the disciples was Jesus's mother-in-law had a terrible fever, and Jesus cured her. Now, I don't know of any other way to get a mother-in-law than to have a wife, but
It's true. If you have any kind of thoughts as to how one would procure a mother-in-law without getting married, please share in the chat. But
I would love to hear theories. But he was one of these core three. And there aren't a ton of instances where we see these three being separated from the 12. There's really three main instances where we see these three disciples pulled apart for a special witness of Christ. And that was once when Jesus healed a leader of the synagogue's daughter who they believed was dead. And Jesus was like, no, she's sleeping. Be quiet, sort of leave us alone. And only the parents and the three disciples we're talking about, Peter, James, and John, were allowed into the room when Jesus brought her back from the dead. The next event was when Jesus went up on a mountaintop, an event we call the Transfiguration. Now, the Transfiguration was when Jesus was his sort of elevated, glorious form was revealed to Peter, James, and John, and alongside him on either side was a visage of Moses and Elijah. And they freaked out. They wanted to camp there indefinitely.
Isn't that what Peter is? Isn't Peter the one who's like, hey, let's set up a tent for all of you guys and we'll just stay here forever?
We'll start building you a camp. Please don't leave.
Yes.
Yeah, that is definitely Peter. And that is, a really powerful event, but it was just those three and Jesus who were there out of those 12. And then the last one is in the Garden of Gethsemane while Jesus was praying. He's praying, and then he pulls himself back to sort of separate himself a little more. And as he does that, he also pulls these three with him to sort of, it's not he's separating himself from all 12, it's that he's separating himself a bit from the 9 of them, and then a little more from the 3 of them. Yeah. And so these are really the 3 events that we really hone in on to say these 3 are special. There isn't a ton of narrative about, and here's why they're awesome. Because, all the apostles walked with Christ, lived with Christ, learned from Christ. Peter, thought to be of a sound adult age, an age wasn't really fixed by the time of, because he was martyred, we can't really look at, well, how long did he live? Because he lived until he died.
Is that not what everybody does, though?
Well, but the issue being, if I murder you, the time of your date has no bearing on your age.
Oh, yeah, that's valid. Yep.
Yeah. I have no plans as such, guaranteed. But we can't use the time of his death as a way to gauge how old he was at the beginning. And so we think he's adult. He was married. He had a mother-in-law. Clearly he wasn't, super young. And also, he was respected among the disciples. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to jump over now to the other 2 who were up on the mountain. The sons of Zebedee, James and John. We'll go with James. We'll deal with them. We'll go with James first. They're really used a lot together in that, they're both fishermen who worked Sea of Galilee. They were both friends of. They knew Peter and Andrew.
Yep.
They fished together alongside each other frequently. And one thing that's interesting about them is that they were called the Sons of Thunder.
Yep.
I don't.
Which is made what you find if if you are a Christian, you've been a Christian a long time, when you get to college and you'll see a fair number of intramural teams that I have seen some guys use this Sons of Thunder as their intramural team name or their slow pitch softball name, which is kind of a really fantastic kind of nickname. If you were gonna get one, like if you missed out on The Rock,
Yeah.
Sons of Thunder is
And I mean, even The Rock, it's like, hey, Stone. It's like,
yeah. It's not
like-
even The Rock.
Yeah.
It's just literally a stone. But okay, yeah. So the Sons of Thunder.
Yeah, and James was likely the older brother of the two because of church tradition saying that John was probably very young, and with John he did die naturally, so we do have an idea that he probably we don't have an
died
exact date.
Sometime between like 90 and 100 AD or something along those lines, right?
That's what people like to say. I mean, it's real hard to pin that down. I would probably not push it to 100.
Okay.
I think the 80 to 90 range is probably more likely.
Okay.
But they were vocal as well, but in different ways. We hear a lot more from John than from James, and part of that is because he wrote one of the Gospels, so he had more personal experiences of himself. But we see that, for example, they were the ones where they came up to Jesus and were like, "Hey, what's our rank going to be in your kingdom?" And so there's this idea that they weren't just because like James, there's not a lot written about James doesn't mean we can't glean a personality from the scripture. We get the idea that he was maybe a little more direct or straightforward or sort of honest or zealous in a way that without the vocalization of Peter, but with a similar sort of I am pursuing this sort of doggedly mindset. With John describes himself as the disciple of Jesus, that Jesus loved.
Yes.
And we see a lot of relational interaction between Jesus and John in the book of John. And part of that is because Jesus meant so much to John, because his relationship with him meant so much to John. But there's also a degree to where we see that a bit in other things. For example, John, at the Last Supper, John was seated next to Jesus. So when Peter wanted to like ask Jesus a question, he was like, hey John, ask Jesus this, And so
Classic.
there is a connection there. John was a lot of the other apostles were martyred. Very few of them lived past 70-ish AD. And so there was, towards the end of the life, there was almost a reverence beginning to be attributed to John that he didn't care for. I mean, he didn't even name himself in his own gospel because it wasn't about him, it was about Jesus.
Yeah. And it's not to say that, like, he ended up living to, whatever, 80, 90 AD for lack of them trying to not kill him. Like, they tried to get him gone. Right.
There are several different accounts of maybe they tried to kill him this way, but eventually the sort of general accepted account is instead of martyrdom, it was exile. It was, hey, we're killing all these other guys and it's only making them more popular. So we're going to put you on an island where no one is there and like just leave you. And hopefully, you don't get this buzz of like, that guy was martyred for his faith. We'll learn from him. Instead, hopefully you'll just sort of be forgotten. And that was the idea behind exiling John. But yeah, he certainly wasn't given any favors.
Yeah.
So the we're going to move on to
So if we talked about the main, we'll call them the main three.
sure.
But these are they typically, this is where a lot of our gospel stories typically come from, those three. Now let's kind of maybe go to the aforementioned rest of them.
Yeah.
The other nine freestanding disciples that Jesus calls in the beginning parts of all of the gospels.
Yeah. So we already talked about Andrew, and we're going to go on to Philip, because Philip was a very early follower of Christ as well. It was said that as Jesus was going into Galilee, he found Philip and called him. And so in terms of where that falls in line of some other stuff, it's probably after Andrew, Peter, John, them, but not by much, if anything. And so an interesting fact is that Philip was also from Bethsaida, the same place as Andrew, Peter. And Philip is a Greek name.
Okay.
So a lot of these have Aramaic, Hebrew names. Every time we say James, it's actually based on the name Jacob that just got translated to Greek, which then got translated to English, and we're just like, James.
Yep.
But we still have the name Jacob as well. So but Philip is a distinctly Greek name. And an example of this is like, at one point, some Greeks wanted to meet Jesus. So like, hey, that guy's named Philip. Let's go up and talk to him.
Okay.
And so these Greeks were wanting to meet Jesus, and they went through Philip because that guy had a Greek name. There was some sort of not necessarily living like a Gentile, but some degree of connection with that world.
Okay.
But that's not to say that he didn't have a connection to the sort of devout Jewish tradition, because he is very frequently paired or associated with Bartholomew.
Okay.
Bartholomew, who John in his book calls Nathaniel, was described as a very devout Israelite. And a last thing before we jump over to Nathaniel is that a lot of times, if Philip isn't being talked about in relation with Bartholomew or Nathaniel, he's being talked about in relation with Andrew. So we can probably guess that Philip and Andrew were at least acquaintances, if not friends. So there may be another connection by which Andrew introduces Jesus to a disciple, or a disciple to Jesus.
Okay.
So Nathaniel, Bartholomew, it's the case that John says Nathaniel, but the other Gospels say Bartholomew. But we're certain it's the same person.
Okay.
And his description is an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. And that was a description from Jesus himself. So I'm pretty comfortable saying that that's accurate.
Okay.
He was from a very nearby town called Cana, which we see from the wedding feast where Jesus turned the water into wine. That happened there. And we see a lot of the very brief glimpse we get of him. We see he's a very devout Israelite who has a nearly typical understanding of messianic expectations, in that Jesus says, an Israelite indeed in whom there is no deceit. And in that exchange, he says, even before Philip called you, I saw you sitting under the tree you was sitting under. And that revelation that he had this supernatural knowledge was enough for him to say, Rabbi, Jewish term for teacher, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. So with his beginning to follow Jesus, we see this Jewish expectation that the Messiah would be an earthly king.
Yeah.
And he fit that criteria as we see his very opening acknowledgement of Christ is, you are the King of Israel. Yeah. What is a little bit different is that he also says, you are the Son of God. And so we see that he perhaps has a better understanding than the common Jew about the implications of a Messiah, about the supernatural expectations of the Messiah. Someone else who probably also had some degree of at least initial expectations of an earthly kingdom, is going to be Simon the Zealot. We skipped a few to get to him because of that correlation.
Okay.
Now, Mark and Matthew called him Simon the Canaanite.
Okay.
Luke calls him Simon the Zealot. And the issue there being the Zealots were a group of radical Jews who thought, God has given us this land, we should not bow to Rome.
Yeah.
They wanted a religious freedom from Rome. They wanted a independence from Rome. They wanted to, a lot of them were very religious in that they wanted to see God glorified through an independent Israel. Some of them were just murderers who didn't like Rome. So it was a whole mixed bag of people. You couldn't learn a lot from the term zealot other than their passion for overthrowing Rome's presence in Israel. And so for these radical Jews, Canaanite could be a term to sort of inform the Romans, like, we view them the same way we view Canaanites, who we tried to just wipe out. We view them as sort of the same level of barbarity as a Canaanite, so please don't associate us with them. And so within like Jewish community, there was a degree to which Canaanite was being used to slander these radicals. And that makes sense because Matthew, who is written more towards a Jewish audience, uses that term, whereas Luke, who's writing to a Greek audience, uses the term zealot. But it was the same idea of someone who is radically against Rome and wants God's kingdom to come. And we see that may have been his origin, but that wasn't his end, because as he follows Jesus, he gets it. I mean, there's not a lot of talk about him outside of the list, but I mean, he wasn't going around stabbing Romans. So
He got it figured out at some point.
yeah. So after Bartholomew, we're going to jump to Matthew. Matthew is also called, in some places, Levi, son of Alphaeus. In Mark 2, 14 through 22, Luke 5, 27 through 39, and Matthew 9, 9 through 17, all record that story. So he was a tax collector, and what that means is that the job of a tax collector was to send money from there to Rome, and a tax collector could collect any amount they wanted, but they only had to send that amount to Rome.
There wasn't like a governing body over top of them that was like making sure that they were being fair. And so in that sort of case, the expectation was they would get the certain number that's what you're saying, that has to go back to Rome, that you're collecting this taxes for everybody. This is kind of the general number that we need to get from you. We don't care how you get it, and anything else is whatever you want to do.
So imagine a police officer who, after they collect a certain amount of money from speeding tickets, any speeding ticket they write goes into their own pocket. It was that sort of mentality of, you're just robbing me and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yes, and in a lot of cases, it's typically worse because these are Jews.
Yeah.
So it's not just like your police officer. It's, I mean, or maybe it is. I mean, ultimately, somebody would have to invade America and then install their own kind of government and then allow Americans to tax their friends and family and not govern what they're taking. And that...
Yeah, it'd be like if that first cut of the police officers' checks went to actively fund terrorists.
Yep.
And like, except the difference being Rome was installed and they were, betraying their Jewish brothers by collecting money to send to Rome that way. So not well respected in the community.
Yeah.
But one thing that we do know about Matthew is that he knew how to throw a party. Because right after he was called, he hosts this huge party. And that's where there's a bunch of tax collectors, there's sinners, there's Pharisees, there's disciples of John the Baptist. It's just like everyone around was there. It's like Matthew was like, hey, you're a person, you're invited. We're having this party because I met Jesus and like he called me, and that's awesome. And that party is the place where we get like sort of the famous story about how Jesus told the Pharisees it's not the healthy that need a doctor, it's the sick. That, and there's also a parable there about new wineskins versus old wineskins, but that all happened at this party where Luke was called. And so we know as a tax collector, he was wealthy at the time of his calling. He clearly could throw a party for a bunch of people at the drop of a hat. And so we see that the life he was being called to certainly wasn't one of glamour or riches. So there was certainly a degree to which he sacrificed a lot materially in order to follow Christ. We're going to come back to him being a tax collector later for something else, but before we're going to jump over to Thomas. Now, Thomas and the ones who follow after this, including Simon the Zealot, there's no record of a specific calling in the Gospels. It is the case where we know a bunch of people were following Jesus, and when Jesus selected 12 out of those people, they were among them. And Thomas, we associate him with having a lot of characteristics, a lot of personality, getting a lot of lines. But all of that happens within the Gospel. He's not really brought up in any way outside the list in Matthew, Mark. And he really has this personality of prove it to me, of I have opinions and you need to work to change them, of a sort of very strong sort of inner world. And one thing, like, and we see that because John brings him up to introduce him to tell that story about how he didn't believe Jesus had resurrected until Jesus presented himself to Thomas. But one other thing I like him is that right before the Lazarus story, or in the middle of it, Jews in Judea had wanted to stone Jesus. And Jesus was like, well, Lazarus is dead, but I'm glad of that because now you can witness more glory. Let's go over there. And the disciples were like, Jesus, the Jews just wanted to stone you. Are you sure that's safe? And he's like, look, we're going. And Thomas says, let us also go that we might die with him. So you see this degree of like grumble, this degree of sass, this degree of like, all right, Jesus. But I mean, he still went. He still followed. There's this degree of grumble sass, as I have written.
I see it. It's written.
That he had. And so another thing interesting about him is that the Aramaic for the twin, I believe, is something like Te Omo. It sounds kind of like Thomas. So there's this question of, is he even named? Because he's also called Didymus, which is the Greek for the twin.
Like if he was just the guy in the group, everyone was like, that's just the twin.
Yeah, like it's I have not looked into it enough to say at all with certainty, but he was called Didymus, which means the twin, and I'm not saying it's likely. I haven't looked into this enough to make any conclusive claims, but it's possible that that's based on Aramaic, the twin, and maybe he's unnamed. I don't know.
Okay.
But it's something that was interesting to me, and I'm like, I want to look into this, but I can't because I have to prepare for 11 other dudes.
All of them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next guy. It's interesting. I'll be interested to find out.
So we remember that Matthew was called Levi, son of Alphaeus. But then we have James, son of Alphaeus. And the first thing is that we have no evidence that this is the same Alphaeus, but we also don't have any evidence that it's not. The fact that it's very clear about Andrew and Peter and John and James being brothers means that the fact that it's not super specific about James and Matthew is
Probably.
a little weird in the sense it would be a little weird if they were brothers. It'd also be a little weird to specify that Levi was the son of Alphaeus if they weren't brothers. So there's really I don't have
Could go either way.
yeah, I don't have any sort of conclusion on that. What I do know is that Catholic sources really want him to be James the Less or James the Lesser, who wrote the book of James. And part of the reason for that is that if he's that James, then Jesus didn't have brothers, which means their whole idea about Mary only having Jesus.
The perpetual virginity of Mary
Yeah. holds up.
that we don't hold to
Right.
in our Protestant faith.
Yeah. We believe that the Bible, when the Bible says, hey, here are the brothers of Jesus, it means Mary had kids.
Yep.
So there's three James that often get confused. It's
Yep.
not just
I can't pick them out of a lineup, but there's the James that wrote the book of James.
yeah,
There's this James, who's the disciple,
yeah,
and then there's another one.
the son of Zebedee that we just talked about.
Yes.
So James the Less, the term the Less is only used once, and it's referred to by Mary, mother of James the Less, and Joseph. And we know that those were two names of Jesus' brothers.
Mhm.
And it's in relation to going and visiting the tomb to distinguish from Mary Magdalene and that. And so I think James the Less is referring to James, the non-Messiah brother of Jesus.
We gotta be very clear. Not everybody from that family is the Messiah.
Right.
It's important.
And-
I get it.
And that James, the son of Alphaeus, was the disciple. But he doesn't get mentioned apart from the lists of the disciples and apostles. Someone else who doesn't really get mentioned outside of that list is Thaddeus, who in Luke is called Judas, son of James. And there's another case where some people want to say James, the son of Alphaeus, was James the Less, James the brother of Jesus. And by saying the technical Greek is Judas of James. There's not a son of in there. But to say that means of means brother would be sort of introducing this new thing that wasn't really used. To say someone of someone means that of someone was their origin, like it was their parent.
Yeah.
And so it would really be introducing this whole new weird mechanic, especially when other disciples were listed as so-and-so brother of James,
Yeah.
of Zebedee, brother of Peter. And so because Jesus had a brother named Jacob, a.k.a. Judas, a.k.a. Jude, and a brother named James, they want to say that this of James means like that's also Jesus' brother, or that's also James the Lesser's brother, and that's not a mainstream view.
Okay.
That is something that gets encountered, but it's really just Judas, son of James.
Okay.
And he doesn't get a lot of screen time in Scripture either. And by a lot, I mean he's mentioned in
Some of these guys are just list guys.
the list.
And it's that doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that they might not have gotten their particular story written down.
It's the case of like their interactions maybe didn't forward the story of Jesus in a way that others did.
Yep.
Because the Gospels isn't the story of the disciples; it's the story of Jesus. Yep. Last one we're going to talk about, Judas Iscariot. There's no recorded calling of him. He's first mentioned in terms of the timeline in John 6:71. This is right after Jesus' really harsh teaching about, if you follow me, you need to give up everyone. You need to eat my flesh or drink my blood or whatever.
And everyone was like, no.
Yeah,
I'm
that
out.
sounds crazy. It sounds as crazy as your summary of it would sound.
Yep.
You're not reading it directly. And so a lot of them left, but it mentions that Peter didn't. It also mentions that Judas Iscariot didn't, or Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, didn't. Now, I talked about how Matthew was a tax collector earlier.
Yes.
But Judas Iscariot was the one who held on to the money box that they all sort of lived off of. You know, if people came up and they're like, hey, Jesus, I got to work my farm, but I really love what you're doing and I want to support your mission, have some money, that went into a money box that Judas Iscariot was in charge of. And in the case where Mary Magdalene used just super expensive, like outrageously expensive perfume to anoint Jesus, we see that Judas sort of snipes, shouldn't that have been sold and the money distributed to the poor? But it's not because like he cared about the poor. It's because he was able to skim off anything in the money box.
Because nobody was really counting it. He
Right.
was expected to count it.
Right. And it was also the case that when people donated more than they needed, they would distribute it to the poor. And so it's the case of like, hey, where'd that money go missing? It's like, oh, I gave it to a poor guy. And they'd be like, cool. And so there wasn't this accountability in regards to, there was no forensic accounting involved.
Yeah.
When you're very fluid with God is going to provide for us, and if he provides for us more than we need, there's someone in need, we're just going to not hold on to that for the future, but just give it away.
Yeah.
It allows for a very fluid financial situation that he could take advantage of. And this is also significant because in John, at the Last Supper, Jesus says to him, what you do, do quickly.
And this is kind of, I think, for people kind of reading this, you're like, how come nobody was like, what do you mean, Jesus? Like, how come the disciples aren't like, I mean, you read that whole narrative, and it's like, the person who's going to betray me is dipping their bread at the same time I am, and then they're dipping it at the same time. And you're like, guys, why are you not figuring this out? Like, how are you not? And then he's like, hey, go do that thing that I'm asking you to go do.
Or what you're going to do, go do it quickly. And the disciples assumed, because he was in charge of the money, either he was going out to buy something or he was supposed to distribute a certain amount to the poor before the Passover. And so the disciples had this expectation of Judas runs money errands.
Yep.
And Jesus is like, hey, what you do quickly. And Judas takes off. They're like, money errand, let's chill. And so there was a lot of trust among the disciples of Judas. There's a reason no one suspected him, but that's because to their perspective at the time, he seemed responsible.
Yep. So, I mean, maybe now we've kind of just generally outlined all 12 guys. I think I've heard it a lot said here, right, that 11 out of 12 of them, so, I mean, if we exclude Judas as the one that they're saying did not, all 11 of them died for their faith. And so I think one of the things that when we talked about this, what I wanted to clarify is just, is that statement accurate? I've heard it a lot, but I haven't really ever dove into it. So it's one of those things where you can hear it enough and you can just repeat it, where you're like, this must be. And then someone somewhere is like, well, what happened then? And you're like, well, the only one I know is Peter. And let me tell you that one. So why don't we kind of go through a little bit each of those guys and maybe how they died or what kind of.
So I'm going to frame this in the sense of sort of mythology, tall tale, because if we look at George Washington, our first president, now, as a kid, I heard the story of the cherry tree.
Yes.
Where he chops down a cherry tree. His dad is like, yo, what happened to my cherry tree? And George Washington is like, I cannot tell a lie. I cut it down. This idea that George Washington never told a lie. And
seems unlikely.
yeah, and it's totally made up. We can recognize that. And there was absolutely the same sort of thing going on in the ancient Near East surrounding this exploding religion of Christianity. People were like, if the apostles have more authority, I want to link my story to the apostles somehow. So you get these things like, oh, this apostle visited here and here and here and here and here and here. Like he went to India and then he came all the way back or whatever. And it's like, clearly there's a lot of stretching going on in regards to what the apostles actually did. They had a very, finite amount of time. Traveling took a really long time. And so you get these really blown up and exaggerated stories about not only where they've been, but also there's this degree of wanting to mythologize how they died. And to give an example of that, I'm going to use Andrew.
Okay.
Now, Andrew,
Not our Andrew, right?
we'll see. Not on live screen,
Got him.
but
Okay.
Andrew was thought to preach, labor, work, minister in the Black Sea area.
Okay.
There's, a lot more likely that it was like the southern part, but there's talk of him maybe going all the way up to Ukraine. Like, it was the Black Sea area. And they say he was crucified on an X-shaped cross because he didn't want to be crucified the same way as Jesus. So instead of like a normal cross, it was like a cow. And that's probably not really accurate. We don't really see a lot of gusto for that story until about the Middle Ages.
Okay.
So the story is that for 2 days while being crucified, he preached. And due to the outpouring of the crowd, the guy responsible was like, they're right. I should let him down. But Andrew wouldn't let them free him. And there's this really like weird and kind of arrogant prayer that someone attributed to him that I'm just going to read because it really illustrates how this isn't accurate to the image we get in the Bible. It's accurate to someone trying to make him look better than the people killing him. It's someone still committed to this sort of idea of glory or being better than your enemies, as opposed to really living in sacrificial service to Christ. So, O Jesus Christ, let not thine adversary loose. I'll rephrase it into modern English. O Jesus Christ, don't let your adversary free him that is hung upon thy grace. O Father, do not let this small one humble any more him that has known thy greatness. But do you, Jesus Christ, whom I have seen, whom I hold, whom I love, and whom I am and shall be, receive me in peace into your everlasting tabernacles, that by my going out there may be an entering into you the many that are akin to me, that are akin being sort of like kinship in terms of related, or like brothers to me, and who are like brothers to me, and that they may rest in your majesty. So there's this idea that, this guy was trying to cut him down from the cross. He's like, hey, God, this little guy who's not important compared to me, like, don't let him do what he wants. Instead, use my death, because we're so close, to bring other people to you, because I'm in charge of the situation. And like there's a lot of them with that sort of mythology stories that really, from any sort of historical analysis, you're like, these are fairy tales.
Okay.
And so what we really want to do is we want to parse out, traditions or stories from history. And really, outside of the gospel, we lose a lot of historical accuracy because there was such a clamoring to be part of this dynamic movement that people would start making claims once they were unable to be disproven in regards to where the apostles went, how they died, what they did. And so we'll see a lot of contradictions, and really what it'll all come down to is that for a lot of them, we just have guesses. And it's because it's the story of Jesus, not the story of these
Yeah.
apostles. That we haven't been given, everyone's ending. In fact, the only one we can say was certain is James, the son of Zebedee. So, another thing about Andrew is that in his crucifixion, it is said that he was bound and not nailed. And that was pretty common for it to be ropes tying you to the board instead of a nail driven into you. Very, very common to not necessarily be nailed in a crucifixion.
Okay.
But, so that's just an example of we have some idea, but clearly there's so much mythology going on in regards to what is happening with the apostles after the Bible. And there's a lot of pseudepigraphal, apocryphal writings where it's like, hey, this is the acts of Jude and Simon. And it's like, were either Jude or Simon involved in that? No?
Yeah. Okay.
So Peter, we have a bit better idea about who, where, and when, but beyond that, there's still guesswork involved. But we're a lot more certain that he was crucified, probably by Nero, possibly in retaliation for the Great Fire of Rome in 1964, in AD 64, that was that Nero blamed on Christians. And it's pretty consistent that he requested to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy of dying the same way as Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean that just because we have these sort of ideas, doesn't mean he is free from embellishment by early authors, because the tradition says that he was encouraged by the Christians to escape as the persecution sort of ramped up. And so he did. But as he was leaving, he encountered this visage of Christ who was walking the other direction. And so he says, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus says, I am come to Rome to be crucified a second time. And so Peter rushes back to be martyred.
Yeah, that doesn't seem...
Yeah. And it's also said that, like, his wife was crucified with him, and that, like, before, that she was crucified first, and that just before then he told her, remember the Lord, whatever. And it's like, some of this is like weird stories, like the Jesus being like, I'm gonna go be crucified again, and Peter like, dibs on that, versus, this like, hey, Peter said, remember the Lord. Like, okay, like, I don't learn anything from that. Maybe
Yeah.
There's so much conjecture here that really a lot of this hyper focus on what happened in like the late first century, second century. There's so much people writing to get in on this hot new trend of religion that there's a lot of misinformation, and it can really take the story away from Jesus. A lot of these fake writings are trying to connect to the religion, and they're like, people are really zealous that they know what there is about Jesus. But these other guys, what happened to them?
Yeah.
And so it was just a market for fan fiction.
One of the things that you wrote on the board was that fanfic, like gospel fanfic, where, it's not necessarily true, but it is this idea of like, well, I bet it would be cool if, and then they wrote it because there's that idea, you kind of mentioned it briefly, of Gnosticism and some of that other stuff, where the idea that I can know truth without ever having been there or seen it or have any real actual knowledge of what I'm writing about. And so that's...
Who says your truth is better than my truth? Well, there's none of that. There's just truth.
Yeah.
Either you got it or you don't.
And so just for sake of time here, let's kind of rapid fire a little bit through some of these, understanding that what we know is a little bit limited.
Okay. Well, having just said what we know is limited, we're going to go to the one that we know for certain, and that's James.
Yeah.
It's real short. In Acts 12, we see Herod III ramp up persecution of Christians by putting James to the sword. It's interesting that Herod the First killed the babies when Christ was born. Herod the Second killed John the Baptist, and Herod the Third killed James. Right after he killed James, he died. There was a degree of divine retribution, but James was the first apostle to be martyred, and he did so by Herod by the sword.
Yep.
Which is interesting that someone so key in like that inner circle would also be the first of those to be martyred. Like there's really such a witness that God used through martyrdom. John. So Tertullian, an ancient historian, claims that he was tossed into a cauldron of boiling oil by Nero, but would not burn, so he was exiled to Patmos. And some other tradition says he was given a poison chalice, but it failed to kill him. The idea just being the general consensus is he was probably exiled instead of killed. But there's a lot of fairy tales about what all happened there. Philip, either he was beheaded in Greece, probably for converting the either wife, well, I say probably, possibly for converting like the wife and or brother of like a guy in charge who didn't like that, or Bartholomew and Philip, who were friends who were paired together, were crucified upside down, and Philip preached from the cross. The crowd decided to release them, but Philip insisted that they release Bartholomew, but leave him on the cross to die, because it's fanfic.
So is it more likely that he was beheaded?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, again, we're seeing there is a common thread here that like almost all of them, we see these kind of brutal beatings that they all kind of take on. And one of the things to be known is the governing authorities at the time have been dealing with a bunch of these so-called messiahs. And the easiest way to have stopped those sorts of stories or those sorts of risings or that sort of things was to kill the leader and then just press hard on all of those disciples that this guy or person had accrued. And so they're just applying the same tactic to the reality of who Jesus was. And so if you're like, why would they, finally decide to exile John? And
most of the time they didn't need to press hard on the followers, because when the Messiah was killed, they're like, well, that was fake. But in this instance, they doubled down.
Yeah,
They doubled down because of the reality of the resurrection. But
Yep. Because they couldn't prove that he was dead and stayed dead. And so then that leaves you in a weird spot when you're in charge of, making sure this doesn't get anywhere else, and you can't refute the claims. So the easiest thing then is to kill the people or brutally beat them until they stop talking about it, because you think it's fake, they think it's real, or it's really real, which that's what I believe.
yeah.
Anyways.
So Bartholomew was thought to head east, bring the Gospel of Matthew to India, and it's said that the Armenian Church claims he then went to Armenia, but he probably more likely died in India. And it says that the tale is he converted a king, and the king's brother, sort of being afraid of like both the degradation of the culture and maybe retaliation from Rome or whatever, had him flayed alive and beheaded. So had all the skin ripped off him while he was alive and then beheaded.
Which is not I wouldn't say it's uncommon, because there is another account in, that's not that terribly uncommon.
It's uncommon in the sense of that's pretty serious, not in the sense of that happens all the time.
Yep.
Like death penalty in the United States, you're like, ooh.
Yep.
Matthew, not a lot of strong tradition in regards to exactly what happened to Matthew. Either he was stabbed to death in Ethiopia after going about Ethiopia and Arabia, or he died a natural death, or at least wasn't martyred.
Okay.
And like, who knows?
Like,
At least I don't know.
yep. I think that's fine.
Thomas is interesting because there are very consistent accounts of his death. They all say he was in India. They all say it was by a spear or by multiple spears. But there's some boldness in that. It's some people have claimed it was July 3rd, AD 72, that Thomas died. That is some claim certainty right there. And it's pretty common or pretty likely that he went from Israel through Syria, heading east, heading towards India. The consistency of that tradition means that's probably the direction he went. Him dying by spear is like there's no way, like there's not really any competing accounts that there are with a lot of other people. So, not sure about the exactness of that date though.
Okay.
James, son of Alphaeus. So the issue here is that the records we have are the records that were preserved. The records that were preserved were the records that fit the narrative. And what fit the narrative was that James, son of Alphaeus, was James the brother of Jesus. And so I have a record of a martyrdom, but I can't tell you if this was James, son of Alphaeus, or James, the brother of Jesus.
Okay.
And so they were at the temple. They were offered an opportunity to renounce. He replied, "Why do you ask me about Jesus, the Son of Man? He is now sitting in heaven on the right hand of great power." And so they threw him down the temple steps in a rage, and someone in the crowd hit him with a club, and he died. And again, obviously this account, too flavorful to really be historical, but I also can't tell you whether it's supposed to be James, the brother of Jesus, or James, the son of Alphaeus, because the history of them kind of merged when it became
Important
important
for the tradition of Mary's perpetual virginity.
Yeah,
Within the Catholic faith,
yeah.
which we could talk about that at some point. But
So Simon the Zealot, he was crucified in Samaria, and then later he was sawn in half in Persia, maybe earlier. He was also crucified in Jerusalem. He was also beheaded with Thaddeus. He also participated in the Jewish-Roman War, and he went to Egypt, Africa, and Britain.
okay,
So we don't know.
okay, that's good to know. It's good to know that we don't know.
Thaddeus was the records. There's not as many as Simon, beheaded by an axe. Maybe with Simon the Zealot, maybe not. That, like I said, there was this book, The Acts of Simon and Jude, who was sort of like this fanfic of Simon and Jude walking through the countryside and saving people and then getting an axe together.
Okay.
And then Judas Iscariot, the Bible talks about his suicide by hanging. And then
So it's one of those where this probably is a topic for its own deep dive, but this is one of those where people will argue, well, see, the Bible, it's not consistent. It has these errors, and this is one of them. How did Jesus die?
Judas. But yeah.
That's one.
Yeah.
Yep. Not Jesus, Judas. Whatever. Words are hard.
So we have 3 bits of information. He bought a field, he hung himself, and he fell and his intestines burst open. His guts burst open. And people are like, hey, in the Gospels it says he hung himself. Book of Acts it says he fell and his, intestines blew out. That's a contradiction. But if you committed suicide, like no one was going to volunteer to like deal with your body.
Right.
He was on his own land, so it's not like anyone had any reason to like need to move the body. And what happens when a bloated body that's already, in the process of decomposing falls while the guts blow out?
Yep.
And so it's a great example of why people are like, contradiction. You're like, yeah, no.
What you're actually seeing in a guy named J. Warner Wallace really, I think, points this well, is what you're getting is different eyewitness accounts of the same exact thing. So, like some people knew that he bought the field, so they say that. And then he hung himself. And the second one is they knew that he killed himself. And when people found his body ultimately, right, like here he was strewn about at the bottom of this, like rocky outcropping. Either way, neither story is trying to really I shouldn't say accurately, but they don't really care about exactly what happened. They care about Jesus and how it kind of fits into the narrative of that. This is like a side note. So they're not spending all of their time, like they didn't go out there.
Yeah, I would say it's not that they don't care exactly what happened, it's that they don't care to prove that the minor details. They will state them because they believe them to be accurate, but they're not going to write a chapter justifying the death of Judas.
Right. And so like when you get two people telling you the same story, right? The facts aren't wrong, they're just slightly different. And so in that sort of that same idea, you get these two different separate accounts. The one in it's Acts and is the other in John. I'm blanking. It's one of the four gospels,
but it's also the case that the one in John, right after his death, the one in Acts, after a while.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole, rotting body falling, really, if those orders were reversed, maybe a contradiction, but really isn't.
Right, he feels bad right away. He goes and hangs himself, and sometime later, they find his body at the bottom of this, cliff hill thing.
However, whatever it looked like,
and it didn't look good, and so they wrote that, and that's that's one of those things. So that's what we know about the disciples. I hope it was helpful and interesting, and we are excited. We got a little something happening on Sunday night. I think we're going to do a little Kahoot game with your family, so hope that you guys watch that and enjoy. So
if there's any topics you want us to cover in the coming weeks, please feel free to harass Lindsay or any of us.
Yep.
But we prefer it when you harass Lindsay.
Always.
Honestly, if you have nothing to say, still feel free to harass Lindsay.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. She won't like it. She's going to say something in chat at some point here. But all right, well, thank you, and we'll be quiet now, so.